Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the old masturbator, Scott Bradfield. We're always trying to catch up. Always no, there Dodo's gets right on schedule. Dodo's obsessed with my head right lately. We're talking today. We're going to do a kind of it's not a compare and contrast. We do several compare contrast type things in the bathtub. One is where we say yay and nay. So we say somebody's cool and somebody's not. That's the most negative episodes. Those are the negative theme shows here. I actually say I hate Kerouac, and people get all pissed off that I hate Kerouac, but I do hate Kerouac. And then I say somebody I like Richard Bradigan. And then we have another one where if you like so and so, you might like such and such. Today we're going to do something a little different, which is basically just compare two writers, talk about two different writers I was reading recently. One of them, Dodo, sorry, is Henry Miller. There you go, Dodo. Henry Miller. And the other one is Louis Ferdinand Celine. That's the biography. I think of a biography of Celine, which I reviewed recently. And I just talk a few things, say a few things about both of the writers. And I'll give you a link to my piece on Celine, which probably upset some people who love Celine, but in all due respect, I like Celine. When people say "in all due respect," by the way, they're basically about to tell you to piss off. I don't think that I don't mean it that way, but that's what they sort of mean when they say "in all due respect." So I don't do it in due respect. I'm just going to say honestly what I think. So here's a few things about both those two writers. When I was a kid, when I was young, learning how to write and reading books, the two other writers who I was told were really important writers were Celine, and this is his most famous book, Journey to the End of the Night, and Henry Miller, Tropic of Cancer. And in fact, one of the people who told me that Celine was a really important writer was Henry Miller. I think I talked about Miller a couple of years ago. I started reading him because he was supposed to read him as he was supposed to be a great writer, and then I kind of fell in love. I developed a real affection for Miller because he was kind of a great teacher. He loved books, and he was definitely a bather. He didn't believe in anything but reading books and getting great pleasure out of his books, and he gave me lots of names of writers who I ended up loving. And Celine was one of the writers he really admired a great deal. In fact, he claimed that when he wrote Tropic of Cancer, he was sort of a late bloomer. I think he published this in his 40s. This was his first published book. It met with a lot of obscenity trial. It was hard to get published. It was probably a banned book in the States particularly, and it was published by some. It may have been published by Olympiad Press. I forget now, but it was treated like pornography really, which is not what it is at all. And Tropic of Cancer was the book that kind of made him famous. And he talked, but it was later books, like the book about Big Sur, and his book about going back to America after many years, which is called The Air-Conditioned Nightmare, which is what he calls America. The Air-Conditioned Nightmare, when he goes back during the World War II to get out of France. So I, as a kid, most of that stuff didn't make any sense. At first, I thought, well, it was going to be really good. There's going to be lots of good sex scenes in it. There's like no good sex scenes in all of Tropic of Cancer. It's a bit obscene. It's a bit gross in some places, and he talks about people picking lice out of their crotches and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's not an obscene book. There's not really a lot of sex in it. It's an angry and it's a book filled with anger and exultation. That's how I think of Miller. He's pissed off all the time, and he's just thrilled about things at the same time. The writer who I did not read much when I was a kid, when I was in my teens, was Celine, and I did get this book. I remember getting it and trying to read it, and I couldn't quite get into it. I didn't dislike the book, and why I liked Miller and I didn't like Celine, I don't know if I'll ever be able to answer. But I did take the opportunity of working on a piece about Celine just recently, so I could go back and try him again. I wanted to read him again and see what I thought of him. Cheers. Cheers to all the bathers out there. And my ultimate opinions were simply that he's he's an angry writer. There's not a lot of exultation in Celine. He's really pissed. He's sick of contemporary world. He's particularly sick of the world of war and the people who profit from war. he comes out of World War One with some terrible injuries and what looks like what many of these young kids that came out of that horrible war with, which was serious PTSD, just came out of it in shock. I was talking to a friend not long ago about his dad who was in the Battle of the Bulge, and he was telling me how when his dad came all his life after this horrible war experience. And I think being in war, which I have not been in, I'm pretty pissed off about the world anyway. Just watching wars on TV pisses me off. But actually being there where people are actually killing each other for usually a bunch of wealthy pricks who are usually running these wars and trying to profit off them, it must leave you incredibly bitter. And this friend's dad was, he came out of it just disgusted with human beings. Just disgusted with human beings that they could do these horrible things to one another. And he spent his life kind of like that. I think of Celine a lot when I think about this friend of mine's dad, and with his stories of people who come out of wars just completely, shattered by it. And this book's Journey to the End of the Night is Celine's first book. He comes out of the war. I don't think of him as he's not a literary writer in the sense. He seems to be more of one of these writers that come out of the early 20th century who are kind of autobiographical writers. And Orwell argues, I'm going to read a real brief bit of Orwell, that Celine really writes his books for a point, to really rail against human life, human behavior, and human society, and just says that they're really awful. They do horrible things. Celine himself did many good things in his life. He was a doctor. He worked with the poor. He was he for a long time, he worked for the Rockefeller Association. He was a man who had ideals, but at the same time, he was obviously a bit shattered by the world. The whole book is hard to read through. It's all well written. It's all very interesting. Many people love Celine, so I'm just saying this in my own personal experience. It's just so much of this diatribe against the life, and this real anger about life, and these real genuine passions about trying to do some good, particularly for some young kid who's sick, in one long passage, and his passions for different people, particularly one woman named Lola, an American girl. And it's just kind of, I find the book a little slow. I find it hard reading Celine, but there's great passages. There's wonderful passages about the idiocy of people who are patriots. People who go out and say, I'm going to fight this war because of my country. There's some really funny passages. There's also a very funny passage about going to the movie theaters in America. And when he goes through America, he really describes it as this huge machinery of just stupidity producing more and more manufactured goods and just providing clean restaurant food that's awful, has no flavor. And it's a kind of a frightening and funny passage. Anyway, he talks about the movie theaters. And I wanted to quote this in my essay, but it got cut for space. I'll read a little passage just to give you a flavor of Celine. It was pleasant inside the movie house, warm and comfortable. Immense organs, as gentle as those in a cathedral, but a warm cathedral, as rich as thighs. Not a moment lost. You plunge straight into an atmosphere of warm forgiveness. You only had to let yourself go to feel that the world had at last become indulgent, unlike the real world, which is not indulgent at all. Already, you almost did think that. Then dreams waft upwards in the darkness to join the mirages of silver light. They are not quite real, the things that happen on the screen. They stay in some wide, troubled domain meant for the poor, for dreams, and for dead men. It's really incredibly powerful. There's great, powerful passages in Celine. So I do recommend you try them. Give them a shot. I love this old Penguin copy. He wrote his second book, Death on the Installment Plan, which is one of the greatest titles of all time. Is I have not read that, but it's about his childhood. I want to go on a little bit more about Miller. I loved Henry Miller most of my life. I still love his work a lot. I like him. He was one of the few writers I've ever kind of wanted to, he died before I could have met him. He was quite an old man when I lived in L.A. I worked in an answering service for his family, his son, and his house, his estate. Anyway, Trap of Cancer is his best known book. It has passages of incredible writing, great beauty, beautiful passages of writing. It's never been my favorite of his books. I just reread that because I wanted to see what it was I liked about Miller, who claimed that he went back when he read Celine's Journey to the End of the Night. He went back and rewrote this whole book, and there you can sort of see some similarities. That kind of intensity and the emotionality of the writing, and the anger and the intelligence behind all the emotions, which are all hallmarks of Celine. The second book of what is considered the trilogy, is Black Spring, a very much shorter book, which is about his childhood. For the most part, it's passages from his childhood in New York, when he was growing up in New York. And I read this first when I was a kid, and I just started rereading it the past couple of days to talk about it. And I think it's one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read. I think I feel the same resistance to Miller and to Celine, which is that I find that people writing autobiographical fiction and autobiographical-like fiction, I sometimes get a little, I get a little worn down. I want a little bit more narrative spark to the writing, and it's almost a little too much of the same thing. But this is one of the best written books I've ever read. I wanted to read one brief passage from this, just because I just love this book. And have I actually marked the passage? Anyway, if you've read him, and you've never read this book, Black Spring, it's my favorite as far as the actual prose of him. And I was reading Orwell's famous essay on Miller, Inside the Whale, and he says the same thing. He says this is what gets some of the most beautiful writing he's ever read. This is a passage where he's looking across the street at a bar when he's a kid. He's talking about being a child and when you first start to experience life, and then you start to understand things about life, and you start being drawn into this world outside your home. And him and his friends would see a bar across the street where the doors would come open and close and people would come in and out, grown adults. And this is just a brief passage of that. And then comes a time when suddenly all seems to be reversed. We live in the mind, in ideas, in fragments. We no longer drink in the wild outer music of the streets. We remember only. Like a monomaniac, we relive the drama of youth. Like a spider that picks up the thread over and over and spews it out according to some obsessive, logarithmic pattern. If we are stirred by a fat bust, it is the fat bust of a whore who bent over on a rainy night and showed us for the first time the wonder of the great milky globes. If we are stirred by the reflections on a wet pavement, it is because at the age of 7 we were suddenly speared by a premonition of the life to come as we stared unthinkingly into that bright, liquid mirror of the street. If the sight of a swinging door intrigues us, it is the memory of a summer's evening when all the doors were swinging softly, and where the light bent down to caress the shadow, there were golden calves and lace and glittering parasols, and through the chinks in the swinging door, like fine sand sifting through a bed of rubies, there drifted the music and incense of gorgeous, unknown bodies. Perhaps when that door parted to give us a choking glimpse of the world, perhaps then we had the first intimation of the great impact of sin, the first intimation that here, over little round tables spinning in the light, our feet idly scraping the sawdust, our hands touching the cold stem of a glass, that here, over these little round tables which later we are to look at with such yearning and reverence, that here, I say, we are to feel in the years to come the first iron of love, the first stains of rust, the first black clawing hands of the pit, the bright circular pieces of tin in the streets, the gaunt soot-colored chimneys, the bare elm tree that lashes out in the summer's lightning and screams and shrieks as the rain beats down, while out of the hot earth the snails scoot away miraculously, and all the air turns blue and sulphurous. There's great passion and beauty and love for life in all of Miller's work, and I guess that's one of the things I love about all his book, but particularly Black Spring. I want to read one or two. I've told you before, my favorite, the only essayist I really loved, I read and reread, is Miller. I'll read two quick passages because he loved both. He was a big fan. George Orwell loved Celine, and he loved Miller. I should mention that in the biography I've just did a piece on, I'll talk about in the essay I'll connect you to. There was a lot of controversy because midway through Celine's career, when the Germans were occupying Paris, and before that, he wrote some essays, some diatribes, political diatribes, which never did him credit, and some of them had some pretty awful anti-Semitic passages in them, and pro Hitler passages. I only could use what I knew from that book, so I'm not an expert in Celine. I mentioned them as much as I could from the book, but it's not a surprise that Celine, who was a lot of greatness in him and a lot of kind of ugliness in him, and who was first person to admit that he had good and bad in him, would say things that were embarrassing to him later. Anyway, Miller, as he did with the other writers, Orwell stuck up for Celine and was still admired Celine's work for pretty much all of Orwell's life. And he also wrote this wonderful essay, particularly based on Miller. He makes a couple of statements here I just thought I'd quote. They're worth looking at. He says, he compares the two of them, and he says, Henry Miller, is simply a hard-boiled person talking about life, an ordinary American businessman with intellectual courage and a gift for words. He says he's just an American businessman, but he's got beautiful sense of language. And he says, but Journey to the End of the Night is a book with a purpose, and its purpose is to protest against the horror and meaninglessness of modern life. Whereas, and then he goes on, he says, Miller is the book of a man who is happy. And I have to say, I think that's it. Orwell makes so many wonderful statements. I do believe that all of Miller's books are basically books of a man as disgusted as he is with the world and with, particularly with America. He's a happy man. And he goes on to make this famous argument about Orwell. And he says, he talks about how he met Miller. And he said when he met Miller when he was on his way to go fight in the Spanish in the Spanish Civil War. And Miller said to him, "You're an idiot to fight for other people's ideals. You're just an idiot." And he said you should take care of yourself and take care of your own life. And Orwell always remembered this. He says, "What most intrigued me about him was to find that he felt no interest in the Spanish War whatever. He merely told me in forcible terms that to go to Spain at that moment was the act of an idiot." You can see Miller saying that. The great essay, Inside the Whale, is that Orwell says that we don't love writers because we agree with them politically. And this is, I think most good bathtub readers know this. We admire them because they somehow elicit they bring beauty into our time in the tub. They bring beauty into our reading, and they bring their own opinion about the world. And he says that what's interesting about Miller, and this could probably say it about Celine, is that they don't write about the world. They live in the world with us. They live inside the whale, and they're reporting what it's like to be in the world that we're in. Anyway, two very, very interesting writers. Black Spring is the secret book. A lot of people, I don't know a lot of people who know Black Spring, but I love that book. We're going to cut now. We're not too long, and I'm going to do another short, brief one in about a minute, based about my new book. It's called Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. It's essays and reviews. I'm self-publishing this in the next few weeks, and I'm going to do a little short piece following this about this and a group project I'm going to suggest. Anyway, all these are wonderful writers. Read them, the ones that give you most pleasure. Okay, bye.